Good afternoon, and thank you for attending our latest webinar. It's great to see so many attendees. This webinar will be a deep dive into the new consumer duty legislation and what it means for learning development professionals within the FS sector. So we really hope you enjoy this session today and find it useful. So without further ado, we'll move on to some introductions. So just to introduce myself, my name is Indy Casbier. I'm the resourcing manager here at Dorr & Scott Williams. So I provide support to clients in delivering learning development projects and initiatives via two DSW service lines. So the first being our resourcing service line. So that's providing flexible and immediate access to expertise and associate talent when and where you need it. And finally, through our consultancy service line by providing a bespoke end-to-end project managed solution. So it's a pleasure to be joined by regulatory consultant Lynn Hargreaves today, who will now introduce herself.
Thank you, Indy, for that nice hand over there. My name is Lynn Hargreaves. Obviously know a few of you who've joined the webinar today, so thank you for that. For those that don't know me, I've spent all my career in financial services, never managed to escape yet, and that's been predominantly in the retail sector. So in terms of employed roles, that was within the operational teams, L&D and T&C, and then I moved into the world of consulting and training, and I particularly focus on the people impacts of regulation. So I think after Christmas now, I've definitely seen it hotting up in the space of consumer duty as people are moving into that space around thinking what needs to happen before July this year. So in general, I think you're going to help me monitor the chat.
Of course, yes. So I'm going to be monitoring the chat box today. So any questions that you have, please submit your questions or comments in the chat box. I'll be monitoring those and feeding back to Lynn as well. We will be sending the recording of this webinar today and a copy of the slides by the end of the week. So you'll be able to review the recording at any time. So yeah, over to you, Lynn.
Okay, thank you. And apologies, guys, you're going to have my dulcet tones for the next 45 minutes. So hopefully, if you've got any questions or thoughts or comments in terms of sharing any best practice, that would be great to hear. So what will we be covering? So I know there's a mix in terms of attendees with regards to the level of perhaps knowledge around consumer duty. So the first aspect is I'm just going to cover briefly what consumer duty is, what it's all about, and take a little bit of a temperature check to see where everybody is in terms of their implementation. We'll then move on to the people impacts. So looking specifically at what I understand to be the main impacts of consumer duty on people, and therefore what do L&D individuals and teams need to consider in terms of meeting the requirements before July. And then we'll do a little bit around next steps. So obviously, it's an opportunity to benchmark as well. We've got a couple of polls in there just to understand where you are across in terms of your implementation. And I'm going to move on to the consumer duty now and kind of recap on the high level requirements. I'm not planning to go into the detail of the 300 and odd pages of the policy statement and the final guidance, but just more in terms of touching on the key aspects of it. I think firstly, it's good to start with, why has this come about? And, if you take a look on the screen here, this is a selection of some of the fines to hit the financial services sector and firms in 2022. And I believe they amounted to 200 million plus in terms of fines, and we're into January of 2023 and they've already levied firm fines of nearly 12 million for two particular firms. So, despite the regulator having their existing powers, they're still concerned that financial services do not always work well for consumers. There's still practices out there that cause harm. That can be online sales journeys that are encouraging consumers to take out credit through the prominence, of that option when it comes to the payment side of it, or perhaps the poor design of products with unclear information about the charges and costs. And, firms are not consistently and sufficiently prioritising those good consumer outcomes, which, is causing, I suppose, harm and reducing trust. Many of you will have seen the recent Financial Lives survey, and I think in that there was only 42% of adults had confidence in the financial services industry, and only 35% agreed firms were honest and transparent with regards to their interactions. And interestingly, those who had vulnerable characteristics and were in debt were more likely to have less confidence in those financial services firms. And trust, is low across the board. I think from the bank's perspective, highly trusted, I think that was 1 in 5 adults highly trusted their bank, which is 20%. And for insurers, that was only 7%. So, we are seeing, that low level of trust and confidence in the financial services sector. And, over recent years, the regulators reviewed GI, distribution chains, the pricing of the products, which was found to be exploiting that customer loyalty. June last year, wrote to lenders to remind them of the standards that they must meet as the rising cost of living started to bite, and within that, bringing attention to firms needing to have better conversations and understand circumstances, and that vulnerable customers were not getting the support that they needed. So really, consumer duty is, a new, more powerful way to hold firms to account, putting the protection of that retail customer front and centre. And what the duty does as well is turns much of the existing FCA guidance around the treatment of retail customers into the more enforceable regulatory rule space. So, for example, the guidance on TCF, vulnerable customers, the tailored support guidance for mortgages, that brings that now into the forefront in terms of application. Now, the FCA have said they'll take a pragmatic approach to the oversight of this initially, but they have said they will take quicker action where they're seeing good outcomes not being delivered. So that's a little bit about the why, and here we've got a quick recap in terms of what consumer duty is all about. So hopefully a lot of you on the call today are into the intricacies and the detail that sits behind it. For those that are not, there's just a quick overview in terms of the new principle. So the new principle, Principle 12, is replacing the existing 6 and 7, where retail activities are taking place. And it's applies to all firms who have a material influence or determine those retail customer outcomes. So it applies, in scope to the end-to-end distribution chain for an organisation, the distribution and the post-sale activities. So in scope of manufacturers who are manufacturing the products and services, so who create them, develop them, design, underwrite, as well as the distributors of those products and services, so the firms that sell, recommend, arrange and offer advice. So, and then underneath that principle sit the 3 cross-cutting rules that must be met and which cut across the 4 outcomes there. So in terms of retail customers and what's defined as a retail customer, well, that's both actual customers and those that are prospective. That's the right pronunciation of it. So those that are shopping around, it includes those. And in terms of that definition of a retail customer, it follows broadly the scope that's in the existing rule book. So in terms of ICOB, MCOB, consumer credit, etc. So, and I know a lot of firms in before Christmas, before the October deadline, were looking into getting validation sometimes in terms of what was covered when looking at the scope. You've then got the 4 outcomes that are looking to be delivered. So products and services is ultimately about meeting the needs and designing products that meet the needs of the target market, that they're sold appropriately through the right distribution channel, and there's an appropriate customer outcome at the end of it. And then the price and value, so making sure that the price set for the product or service represents fair value. Then the consumer understanding, so that firms need to act and support and inform decisions, support customers in making that right decision at the right time. And that includes both that collective consumer, so in terms of the marketing and the literature that's out there, as well as that individual customer interaction with a particular firm. And then consumer support, which is all about firms supporting consumers in terms of the product or service that they've more bought, and it meets their needs through that full life cycle. Just having a quick look on there, and I'll come in terms of the questions and answers. Thank you, Jawad, for bringing that one up there. I'll take a little break at times and have a look at the Q&A and see if we can build those in as well. In terms then of the timeline for consumer duty, this will probably be imprinted into a lot of people's minds in terms of it. So the end of October deadline was the focus for firms in terms of ensuring that people had the education and the understanding around consumer duty, that the scope was confirmed for the firm, and completing that gap analysis, resulting in the devising of an implementation for the board to sign off. Now, from what I've seen in terms of those implementation plans, they've really ranged from the high level detail, a plan for a plan, to the more detailed account. And I know a number of firms have been asked to share their plans with the FCA, and others have voluntarily shared that with their supervisor as well. I haven't seen any feedback yet from those, but the FCA have said that they will share the generic findings around that. Also, firms have had to appoint a consumer duty champion at board level. So this is somebody alongside the chair or the chief executive is there to ensure that the duty is being discussed and regularly raised in the relevant discussions within the organisation. So that needed to be somebody who was independent, with the right skill set and capabilities to understand that and challenge effectively. The next deadline, that's from a manufacturer point of view, as well as distributors, that's key, is the April deadline. So that's for firms who are manufacturers who need to undertake those product and value assessments of all their products and services, looking at the data and the evidence, and about whether they can demonstrate that their products and services are delivering that fair value. And if they find that they're not, make those necessary changes to the price or the structure of that product to ensure that the customers get that fair value. And, you know, The challenge, I think, for some manufacturers around this is to complete this, obviously, on their open product and service range, and it's probably influenced by the complexity of that product range and the numbers within there. Obviously, those in terms of insurance, they already have to adhere to the product governance rules, so probably less of a task there. But from a distributor perspective, those where the manufacturer and the distributor differ, they're waiting for that information as well. And I think that's a challenge in terms of, if you're a distributor, distributing more than one product from more than one manufacturer, that management information, that data could come in many different forms from the different manufacturers. So I think, trade bodies are trying to develop a template in some sectors. Obviously, there's hopefully encouraging discussions between the manufacturers and the distributors of what that should look and feel like in this run up to April. The next deadline, in terms from a timeline perspective, is that 31st of July 2023, which is about the implementation of the consumer duty, and obviously therefore firms have to be demonstrating and complying with the duty at that point. So firms have to have in place the appropriate MI monitoring. The training needs to be complete, and hopefully then there will be an embedding and an evaluation plan thereafter. July 2024 is when that first annual report is due from a board perspective, where the board confirms that they are meeting the requirements of the consumer duty in terms of their performance. And within implementation plans, there's obviously lots of detail going into what does that MI look like, where are our gaps, but obviously firms shouldn't be waiting till that first annual report. That board focus and that understanding needs to be there from implementation through to 2024 in July. And at that point as well, the implementation of consumer duty for the closed books comes into play. I think the focus, as you probably would expect from most firms, has been on the implementation plan, making sure the consumer duty champion's in place and that gap analysis piece, and getting external ratification where needed on those plans and scope. But we are, this webinar is focused on the L&D perspective of it, and I think for those of you that have been party to regulatory changes, then usually in that implementation plan, we're towards that back end, and then the focus comes towards the latter stages. And unfortunately, that deadline of July 2023 is not going to move. So, ultimately, the consumer duty is looking to achieve, the right products and services, making sure that there's the appropriate information, there's no sludge practices there, so it's easy for customers to switch, they can get the support when needed, and that the needs of vulnerable customers are met. And yes, there are very detailed rules and specific outcomes, but the outcomes focused approach leaves considerable scope, I think, for firms to interpret how they apply this. With that, I suppose, comes the room for disagreement with the regulator on that. So the FCA stated that it's for a number of firms, the expectation here is a real shift from following those prescriptive rules to demonstrating those good outcomes. And I think, firms need to understand that shift, that, from a following a rules and guidance approach and being perhaps reactive to demonstrating consistently, or how you are consistently delivering those good consumer outcomes. So that move from the reactive to the proactive, and that from the reviewing lag indicators to lead indicators. And from a regulatory perspective as well, it's all about the, show me, demonstrate it, provide that evidence, not the tell me what you're doing about it. Key challenges, in terms from a firm perspective, good to get a view if you agree with these challenges. I think there's that challenge for firms around outcomes to define, what does that good outcome look like, and from whose perspective, what does that foreseeable harm, in the context of the products and services we provide, what does that look like, and what does effective outcomes monitoring look like as well. Culture, and the current culture and thinking within firms, the work I have done, or some of the conversations being involved with, is around there's nothing wrong with what we do. Customers and consumers are at the centre of what we do and the decisions that we make, and we've never had a problem before. And I think that that culture and that mindset within a firm and thinking that way perhaps can do a firm a disservice in terms of how they approach this. And in terms of capabilities, a challenge around really understanding what are the people capabilities within the firm across all different levels and roles. So where do we need, and the firm understanding where do we need to invest and upskill existing teams, and how will we iteratively implement and continually improve. So that's been, I suppose, a whistle-stop tour of hopefully bringing everybody up to speed if they weren't, in terms of the why, the consumer duty, high level what it's all about, and some of the challenges there. But it would be good to understand from people that are on the webinar, understanding where you are in terms of your L&D activities. So Indy's going to bob the poll up in there. So if you can just, this is anonymous, so it's just to get a little bit of benchmarking across the attendees on here in terms of where you are with your L&D. So you haven't started yet, it's a line on the implementation plan, you're at the education, you've got the business case, or you're actually moved into the design phase. I'll give you a few seconds to complete that. Sorry, Indy, are you able to publish the results from that? Oh, smashing, thank you for that. Okay, quite mixed there. So some of us are still relying on the implementation plan, educating, briefing people throughout the organisation. And then a couple have started on the design phase. So I think that's probably reflective of what I'm seeing across the different sectors in terms of it. So for those that haven't yet started, there's a little bit of comfort in terms of knowing where some of your peers are, and a number of you have completed the needs analysis, so you're moving then into the design phase. So thank you for sharing that. And I think the reason for asking that is kind of hopefully what I'm going to cover in this latter half of it. Hopefully will confirm your approach in terms of your needs analysis, or what you're starting in terms of your design, or help you if you're getting to the point of doing your gap analysis. So in terms of the people impacts of consumer duty, I think a number of firms, and there's nothing new around that, implementation predominantly concentrates on the policies and the processes and what are the gaps. But please don't forget there's renewed determination from the FCA here to focus on the people side. So how the people behave, how they perform, their fitness and propriety. And I think in the past, if you were party to a supervisory visit, as I was with MMR, it was about demonstrating you got the right policies. This was the training you were putting in place and the framework. And if you could successfully articulate that, then you'd get that tick in the box. I think what that shows now, and what that doesn't necessarily demonstrate clearly, is what are you doing and how those measures are delivering those good outcomes for consumers. So how do you prove it? So I think from a scope perspective, you need to consider the full scope of consumer duty and who that touches. So in terms of the customer life cycle, it's not just the customer facing colleagues, it's those in the product design through to to the back office roles. And in terms of the product life cycle, it's roles from your senior board, your non-executive directors through to customer facing teams. So it does impact and touch on everybody who has a party to play in that retail customer outcome. I think you need to ask yourselves what you have in place to demonstrate competency of people, and perhaps for some firms shift approach from that tick box to a focus on how you demonstrate and create those good outcomes. And lastly, how you measure the customer centricity, how do you measure the behaviours across those roles for people. So the consumer duty, as well as those outcomes and the new principle that we talked about, introduces the new conduct rule, which is you must act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers, which will replace the existing conduct rule 4, where the individual is touching on that retail activity. And the regulator has made clear that the more senior a person is and the more relevant their role is to consumer duty and having that impact on the customer outcome, the more they will expect of them. And the regulator, as we know, the expectations around conduct rules is that firms provide the relevant training so that they understand their obligations under the consumer duty. You will have all seen the positive and negative indicators in relation to conduct rule training, and I'll bob that in the chat at the end. But, in terms of that conduct rule, that means around demonstrating that people understand the cross-cutting rules and the obligations of acting in good faith, avoiding foreseeable harm, and the enabling and supporting. So from an L&D perspective, individuals need to have the broad understanding of the consumer duty, but the deeper understanding of what that means in terms of the practical application in the role. And there is a role for L&D in terms of how do you bring that to life. I would say that's probably not a generic e-learning module. But, the closer the individual is perhaps to providing and enabling the support for retail customers, so perhaps in the advice space, in the arrears space, then there's the responsibility on that individual to help the customer, guide the customer, help them make informed decisions in their best interests. And I think that signposts nicely into the enabling support piece in a little bit more depth. Just checking on time as well. The new principle states that obviously firms must act to deliver those good outcomes, and that includes helping the consumer pursue their financial objectives. And within that, that's about firms taking into account the impact of behavioural biases and the impact of vulnerable characteristics and how that influences the customer's needs and decisions. And we know that this high level of protection is there for retail customers because typically they can lack the experience or the expertise in the product and services, and they're susceptible to these behavioural biases, and that information asymmetry is frequently involved in those activities. And these biases can affect decisions when customers are making purchasing financial products. So I think if there was ever a case for role-based conduct rule training and that individual interaction around a solution, I think behavioural economics is that. And it'd be good if you could just bob in the chat, is that something that's built into your induction, your refresher training? And I think this is not just for the customer facing staff that are involved in supporting enabling the customers to make those decisions, but also the people that are designing your products, that are designing the distribution strategy and the online web experience, because these biases exist not just in the customer facing space, but also in that virtual space and that online space. Vulnerability and the conversation around this has been there for a long time from a regulator perspective. We've got the finalised guidance back in 21, which had a particular focus on the skills and capability of staff. Then in June 22, the regulator reviewed how well that guidance was being implemented and outlined those areas for improvement. And again, this was about ensuring that staff had the right skills and capability. And what was in there is that there's limited evidence of management information that demonstrates whether vulnerability training for staff is resulting in those improved customer outcomes. So, we're witnessing now a deepening cost of living crisis. I was reading the other day, I think it was an L&G survey, I've wrote it down here. The average UK customer is just 19 days away from the breadline. 22% of the population lack basic digital skills. The older generation's not necessarily tech savvy, and people are living to a greater age, but therefore that means more poor health issues. So in terms of those vulnerable customers and the numbers, that is only going to increase. So you do need to be confident that your vulnerability training and your approach to that, both from the product design and the customer journey design, takes into consideration vulnerability and those that are vulnerable within your target market. And I think also in this space, I think back in November, the borrowers piece, so those that are lenders on the call here in the financial difficulty space, also pulled together 4 key areas that required consideration of improvement. And, that was engaging with customers, effective conversations, and helping customers obtain that third-party support. There was also in there as well reference to a lack of training and vulnerability training within induction and refresher training in there. So from an L&D perspective, and in terms of the expectations around vulnerability that are now brought more to the forefront from a consumer duty perspective, are there areas that you would say that in terms of the regulatory expectations that perhaps you're not quite there in terms of demonstrating. So in terms of your training, is that tailored to the role? Is it effective? Does your data, your MI, demonstrate your effective approach and customer centric? So I think if Indy, if you can run that poll for me, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So it may be that, you know, in a couple of these areas, you're really confident in terms of your firm demonstrating the regulator's expectations, but there may be areas perhaps that you're less confident that you would be able to articulate and demonstrate those expectations. Okay, hopefully everybody's had a chance to vote on that. Let's have a look, see if everybody is really confident with what they're doing in that space. So, yeah, interesting there. So data looks to be a particular area in terms of having that effective data in place that is demonstrating. And that'd be interesting is, you know, is that the people data involved in that as well, and ensuring that the training on vulnerability is tailored to the role and the harm. So yes, so you know, I think, you know, from that, it's good to kind of see where people are in terms of it, and perhaps there is still room for improvement. And for me, it's understanding why are you in that position, what are the gaps, and how is that going to be improved on during this run up to the implementation deadline. And, you know, and I think as well, it's key that the culture is right within the firm. And, you know, the consumer duty, going right back to the beginning of the webinar, is there to encourage firms to analyse their culture and how that affects their conduct. And, you know, be interesting, which we can't go into in any depth today, but to understand where people were struggling. Did they feel that was that influenced by the culture within the organisation, perhaps that turn from the top, that teams were perhaps not engaged and empowered to make decisions in the interests of the consumer, and were perhaps not necessarily measured on that. And there were perhaps gaps in terms of that. And I've got one last polling question, which hopefully you can help me get a feel, and yourself get a feel from your peers on the webinar there, in terms of your customer facing staff and handling those customers, whether they have potentially vulnerable or they are demonstrating those characteristics. Which of the following is your greatest challenge? So this is a select one. So is it that you know, the measurements of meeting the needs? Is it empowering staff to make those decisions, competent and capable people? Or is it the delivery of the ongoing training to support there, but perhaps because budgets are being cut in this area? I'll give you a couple of seconds, well, a few seconds to provide a view in terms of your challenge around that. Okay, hopefully everybody's had opportunity to provide a response. Okay, so the empowerment piece there. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to have a further conversation around the reasons for that. You know, why is that? Is that because it's the command and control culture within the organisation? Is that because the culture around actually putting the customer first and making those decisions is not supportive and not embedded throughout the organisation? Is it because actually the training or has been cut, or actually the support is there and it's very much around policy and process rather than the skill and the competency of the individual? But yes, some really interesting results there. Thank you for sharing that. And I think, you know, just to touch on, you know, obviously the polling questions give me some great insight, but also it's there to, from your personal perspective, to think, well, actually, yes, these are the challenges we have. This is perhaps where our gaps are. What are the solutions from an L&D perspective that we need to be focusing on from a consumer duty implementation? I think measurement was touched on there in terms of the competence and capability. And obviously, the regulator has said as well, you know, it's key to demonstrate the effectiveness of your training and how that goes from the training to application into the role. So, you know, I put this on there because, you know, firms, if they wish, you know, may consider those T&C principles in terms of demonstrating competence and capability. So yes, you know, people have to have them in place for the provision of mortgage advice, you know, the insurance requirements, etc. But how do you demonstrate that competence and capability for the staff that you've got handling complaints, having the mortgage and the arrears conversations? So how are you demonstrating from the training environment that those skills and behaviours are being demonstrated in role? So I do know in terms of some firms, they are considering and or have in place a wider application of T&C principles across, because that helps them support and provide that data and evidence in terms of application in role. The other side of that as well is, though, to provide that measurement, you have to define what does that outcome look like. So what are your expectations? How do you define that? What does good look like? What are the expected behaviours? And I think, you know, in terms of firms, you should ensure that your standards are capturing the vulnerability piece, capturing the behavioural economics piece, and around how that meets your target market needs. You know, I think you need to review your competency measurement tools and focus on that demonstration of the good customer outcome. So to ensure that, you know, your managers, your supervisors and your individuals understand, you know, what does good look like and what are the application of those skills and behaviours that you're going to be measuring in terms of those customer interactions. Making sure I've got enough time to answer if there's any questions at the end. So from an L&D perspective, we've touched on, you know, those key people impacts in terms of consumer duty. So in terms of, I know a number of you had said you were on the needs analysis piece, or you've moved into design, which obviously infers the needs analysis has been completed. But what I would be saying here around the analysis, your scope needs to encompass all those touched by consumer duty. So, you know, don't forget your back office, don't forget your senior management teams. You know, it's the whole organisation in terms of that delivery of that customer outcome. And, you know, and what does that mean in terms of their role? Agree the objectives, the learning objectives. They may be more different dependent on that needs analysis, dependent on the role, and what are the success measures. But the key to this is going to be agreeing your evaluation approach. So, touched on earlier, the FCA has highlighted, particularly in the space of vulnerability, a lack of training in induction and refresher training on vulnerability has been a key contributor to those poor outcomes. So, you will have your success measures from, that delivery of the training. What does the evaluation piece look like? How are you going to measure that transfer from classroom or virtual environment into the role and understand that? And I think your solution design, for some roles will be purely about the sharing of knowledge and the regulation and what's happening. But for other roles and individuals, and particularly probably customer facing, it's about that building of the critical skills needed. So, the skills piece is both the knowledge and that opportunity to practice, repeat it, implement that learning. So it's, transferred to the long-term memory and the daily approach of the individual within their role. So, for a number of roles, I don't think this is a one-hit e-learning module, because is that developing the application of the skill. It's definitely perhaps testing, understanding, and knowledge recall. But, people need that follow-up, that practice to apply in the role. So, you need to involve, and your solution needs to consider the support from managers and coaches in role, and, to ensure that long-term behavioural change is in there. And as well, might be a step too far in terms of from an L&D perspective, but, initiatives and performance management, reward need to be aligned to focus and support on this. So, what I would say here is if firms, which, they have traditionally done in the past, sometimes focus on, a change in regulation, what does that mean for our processes? What does that mean for our systems? Where are our gaps? What do we need to do? What's our marketing literature? How do we demonstrate that price and value? Don't just focus on that, take the view from the regulator in terms of how important the people piece is in delivering this, and develop your approach around that. And lastly on this, consumer duty is all about the evidence. It's about the data. And from an L&D perspective, when you're completing your approach, your implementation and your measurement of effectiveness, you need to consider data sources around this. How are you going to prove and demonstrate that your approach is delivering those good consumer outcomes in terms of the people? So, your evaluation around effectiveness of training, monitor the outcomes. What else have we got on here? The outcomes from file checks, if that's relevant, customer feedback, complaints, staff feedback processes, vulnerable customers, data, T&C data, all that in terms of an L&D consideration in about demonstrating the successful approach and ensuring, that you are demonstrating staff are delivering those cross-cutting rules, supporting customers and delivering the outcomes is key here. So I'm conscious you've listened to me talk a lot, and I think there was a question from Jawed at the beginning there. So let's put on here. Says, I've seen a number of views around approaching the new duty. Some are of the view it requires a new consumer duty framework within firms and some mapping principles and rules, and then showing existing processes are aligned. What's your view? I have seen both, Joad, so yes. I would start at, what do you need? What is the management information? What are you going to present to the board to demonstrate? So what does good look like there? And then work back and see what have you got and where are those gaps would be my approach to it. I think there's always got to be a mapping piece of the more detailed rules and guidance that sit under the different outcomes, you know, to ensure that you've not missed anything there. But this is about demonstrating what you are doing, how you're effectively reviewing it, how it's central to your firm. So I would start at, what does good look like? What have you? What do you want? And then where are your gaps from there? Hope that helps a little bit. Any other questions in terms of thoughts and views in terms of where you are that you might want to ask of others or myself? Oh, Lou, you said, I think chat is disabled. Sorry. Didn't know that was the case. If you've got anything, sorry, please just bob it in Q&A if chat's not working. We're a quiet bunch. Are you already wanting to get ready for your next meeting? What's that? Part of the challenge at the moment is that we haven't yet defined all the process changes. Yeah. So from a learning perspective, yeah, you don't know what you're necessarily training out. Yes, definitely. The agile piece as much as possible in terms of that. But yes, and that's the challenge from an L&D perspective, is your drop dead date will not move to the right. And I suppose all I can say there is really just encourage that partnering of L&D with those teams that are defining the process changes, and that if they can be close to that, they can be building the learning solution at the same time near us, instead of waiting. And then I suppose more the waterfall approach, but if firms can try and accommodate it from a resource perspective, a little bit of agileness around it. Any other questions or thoughts or views or areas that people are struggling with? Yeah, so Lewis put on there from a T&C perspective, having a wide range of measures. So no, I think where people have got a mature T&C framework, where they are already capturing vulnerability, how colleagues are handling those aspects of it, and the delivery of that consumer outcome. If you've got that mature approach in place, then I wouldn't expect that to change. If, however, your approach to T&C is basically, yes, vulnerable customer handled okay, tick a box, then that perhaps is not sufficiently evidencing it. So you may need to just think of enhancing and tweaking that. And I would say, don't forget the behavioural economics piece as well. I don't know if firms are still using that. I mean, that was a while ago from an FCA perspective, but obviously that's been brought to the forefront again in the consumer duty space. It is around that. So, you know, are you confident that your staff understand that in terms of, I suppose, proportionality in their role? Any more questions or thoughts? Last one there. Well, you might be able to see when a product is used, which is, how can you judge whether that was a good outcome for the individual customer? I think, Andrew, that is across the whole life cycle. And in terms of the product and service and price and value outcome there, it's about defining that collectively. Could go into a little bit more depth in terms of the price and value piece and the product and service and target market. But I think it's about defining those measures up front. So what does good look like at that point? Is it using the insurance? Is it being effectively having a call handled? So there'll be a number of measures across both the product and the customer journey. So that's probably not the most helpful, because we need a little bit of time together in terms of your particular industry and product, but it is about considering what does good look like across that end-to-end product life cycle as well as customer life cycle, and the measures that you would use across that. Indeed, just conscious of time and letting people go. So hopefully that's been useful for people, and it's confirmed what you knew or what you're doing, which is always good. And there's some considerations that you might build in to your approach in the run-up to July of this year.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We really hope that you enjoy the session and able to take away some useful information. My contact details are displayed on the screen, so if you require any further support or have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to me. We will be sending over a short survey in the coming days, along with a copy of the slides and the recording link. And we would welcome any feedback on this webinar today. And if there are any topics or any further sort of insight that you require from DSW, we would very much welcome your suggestions, as we will be running further webinars this year. So any suggestions for topics would be really welcomed. So I'd just like to finish by thanking Lynn today for an excellent session, and thank you for delivering this session for us today, Lynn. So thank you very much. Please do follow our LinkedIn for further insights and further updates. We are active on LinkedIn and all the social media platforms, so please feel free to drop us a follow. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you everybody, and thank you for those that participated in the poll and the chat at the end. Thank you very much.